Alrighty, folks, let's get going.
So we move in the next hour from the 19th and 20th century to ancient and early medieval history with a panel entitled From the Roman Empire to Early Islam, Emperors, Religion, and the Place of Women. And I am going to take Professor Deutsch's strategy here of introducing everyone at the beginning, and then they'll just go up in turn. Please take notes and be ready to engage with any of our presenters. So, first of all, we have Carole Eteye, wave when I who is a graduating senior double majoring in classical and Near Eastern religions and cultures and political science. Her primary academic interests are early Roman imperial history and U.S. foreign policy. After graduation, Carole hopes to gain some more work experience before applying to law school. She loves to travel, has visited 14 countries, lived in 3 of them, and is a citizen of 3 countries, Nigeria, Canada, and the U.S. Okay, Hailey Pavelka is graduating this spring with a BS in biology and a BA in classical and Near Eastern religions and cultures. Her favorite subjects to study are evolution and philosophy, the latter of which drew her to the particular focus of her senior thesis. In the fall, she will begin a Doctor of Pharmacy program at Oregon State University's College of Pharmacy. And a final distinctive fact about Hailey is that she is a triplet, and all 3 sisters will be graduating from different institutions this May on the same day. So congratulations to the parents. Okay, our third presenter will be Emma Sparks, who is a graduating senior pursuing a Bachelor of Arts in History with a minor in business law. Her history concentration is in late antiquity and early Christianity, with a particular interest in women's religious authority and monastic traditions. While working on her thesis this fall, Emma also managed to train for and run the Twin Cities Marathon. After graduation, she plans to take a gap year to travel, starting with a few months in Spain, before attending graduate school in either law or history. Ainsley Pauna hails from the town of Prior Lake, Minnesota. She will be graduating with a history major and a minor in French studies in May. When she's not studying, you can find her experimenting in the kitchen, reading a good book, or training for the upcoming Twin Cities Marathon. Something about ancient history and marathons. With 2 excellent options for next year, Ainsley has decided to pursue her Master of Education in Social Studies at the University of Minnesota, and she's very excited to be stepping into the field of education. So, move on first with Carole.
It's already on.
I'll just hold it. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Professor Sterk, for the excellent introduction. As she said, my name is Carole Eteye, and the project that I'll be discussing today is titled Damnation Memoriae and Imperial Deification, the Persistence of Memory in Roman Antiquity. A quick overview of what I'll be discussing today. First, I'll run through the meanings of the terminology that I'm working with. I will then discuss my claim. I'll give you guys a little brief overview of the main players of my thesis, the Roman emperors Vespasian and Domitian. I'll then discuss Domitian's association with tyranny, specifically aspects of sexual intemperance and hypocrisy. And finally, I'll go into differences in historical narrative of the sources that I'm working with. I would like to begin with an excerpt from the ancient author Suetonius' biography about the Emperor Domitian that details his Damnatio Memoriae. It is by far the most extensive account that we have of the memory sanctions that were levied against Domitian, and I personally find the language very indicative of what Damnatio Memoriae as a process was. The Senate slandered the dead emperor with the most reproachful and bitter kind of outcries. It even ordered that ladders should be brought in. and his shields and images should be publicly demolished and smashed on the ground at that very instant. Finally, it decreed that his entire memory should be obliterated, and his inscriptions everywhere erased. That's really frightening language, at least to me, and I've highlighted the most important lines in this text. These are telling of what Damnatio Memoriae as a process really was, and I would like you all to keep this passage in mind as I move through my presentation. Imperial deification was a formal process through which a cult of worship was established for a Roman emperor. This did not necessarily mean that this emperor was now equivalent to other Roman gods like, say, Jupiter or Juno, but it meant that he now dwelt in heaven with the gods. It typically occurred through senatorial decree. Now, even before the 1st century CE, which is the period that I'm working in, Romans were familiar with ruler worship, mainly through contact with their Greek neighbors. A good example of Roman ruler worship before the 1st century is the veneration of Rome's mythological founder, Romulus. After his death, Romans worshipped him as the deity Victorinus. Now, most people, when they learn about imperial deification, would expect that all Roman emperors were deified, but that is not the case. Of the 12 emperors who ruled in the 1st century, only about 5 were actually deified, and this shows that deification was not freely given to all emperors. It seems to be something that had to be earned through specific behavior. And now, for anyone living in the United States, a historically democratic nation, this idea of worshiping a politician may seem very foreign to us, but we have some modern, and I would hope very concerning examples in our own society that we can draw from. I've included images, all related to President Trump, some as recent as even just 2 weeks ago, that allude to the idea of the American president as a god, or his preferred euphemism, a doctor. I've included these images to show us that although we lack the formalized institutions to deify our rulers, the idea of ruler worship should not be so foreign to us. Now, Damnatio Memoriae, on the other hand, is a modern term that's ascribed by classical scholars to a series of processes whereby monuments, edicts, coinage, statues, literary works, anything related to a disgraced public official or emperor were destroyed or altered. This is what Suetonius is describing when he mentions the obliteration of Domitian statues and the erasure of his inscriptions. And like imperial deification, Damnatio Memoriae also occurred through senatorial decree. In the 1st century, 3 emperors actually received memory sanctions, one of whom, Domitian, I will be discussing today. Now, as both Damnatio Memoriae and imperial deification were acts of the Senate, it does seem fair to me to say that whether one was deified or condemned depended in large part on their relationship with the Senate, maybe even entirely. Simply put, an emperor who was not well liked by the Senate likely was not getting deified. But just because statues and coinage were destroyed does not actually mean that the intent of the process was to forget someone. Extant sources on condemned emperors criticize them, giving us context to the defacement of their monuments. These literary sources show that Damnatio Memoriae was both a punitive and a cautionary measure. Punitive because an emperor lost the privilege of a favorable posthumous memory, and cautionary because it served as an example to other emperors of behavior that ought not to be emulated. I've also included ancient examples of Damnatio Memoriae and a modern example, the removal of Confederate statues in the South, which should be removed, just want to say that. So what really is my assertion? Typically, in discussions of memory construction in Imperial Rome, Damnatio Memoriae and imperial deification are treated as distinct and separate processes. I argue instead that imperial deification would not have been an effective taming mechanism, urging emperors to maintain a good relationship with the Senate had Damnatio Memoriae not existed as a parallel contemporary practice. Now, I mentioned that out of 12 emperors, 5 were deified and 3 were condemned. That leaves 4. The existence of these 4, who were neither condemned nor deified, highlights the significance of Damnatio Memoriae and imperial deification as contemporary practices. While emperors could remain as they were after death, being neither deified nor condemned, in the potential face of an elevation, Damnatio Memoriae reminded future emperors of the depths to which they could be thrown if they took their behavior too far, and the Senate deemed them unworthy of divinization as a result. I've included a quick little timeline of the dates that I'm working with. In 69 CE, Vespasian becomes emperor and founds the Flavian dynasty. In 79 CE, he dies and his first son, Titus, becomes emperor. In 81 CE, Titus dies and the second son, Domitian, becomes emperor. And in 96 CE, Domitian dies, bringing the Flavian dynasty to a close. Now, Vespasian was the last of the 4 emperors in 69 CE who established the very short-lived Flavian dynasty, comprised of only himself and his 2 sons, Domitian and Titus. He himself enjoyed a fairly good relationship with the Senate, who actually deified him after his death. According to one of my primary sources, Suetonius, who I began with, Vespasian, before he died, made the very silly remark, and I find it silly probably due to the old translation I'm working with, "Oh dear, methinks I'm becoming a god." Although this is a very funny phrase, it does highlight the political mechanisms that underpinned deification in Rome. That Vespasian could confidently say on his deathbed that he would become a god speaks to the nature of his relationship with the Senate. Now, I would be remiss if I did not mention the emperor who succeeded Vespasian and preceded Domitian, Titus. For the purpose of my project, I am ignoring him almost in entirety, but I just think it's important to throw his name out here for you guys. Like his brother, but unlike his father, but unlike his brother, he had a good relationship with the Senate and was ultimately deified shortly after his death. Ancient authors do claim that Domitian assassinated him, but I think that's just likely another claim to denigrate Domitian's memory. Now, unlike Titus and Vespasian, Domitian was not well liked by the senatorial elite. In fact, most ancient authors who actually write about him portray him in a very negative light. He is depicted as a flagrant violator of Roman cultural norms, a cruel and paranoid tyrant, and a sexual hypocrite. And I'm going to expand on this idea of sexual hypocrisy. As I mentioned, deification was not something that was freely given, it was earned. So to justify why Domitian was denied a deification, and even on top of that, condemned, ancient authors spotlight his sexual depravity and hypocrisy. Typically, under normal circumstances, an emperor's military accomplishments were a bellwether for his deification. If that holds true, then Domitian should have been deified. He had a fairly good military record in Germania. But despite this, ancient authors downplay his military successes, emphasizing his sexual intemperance and hypocrisy instead, which would have disqualified him from a deification. This is because sexual license was closely associated with tyranny in ancient political and literary writings, and a tyrant cannot possibly receive a deification. Temperance was an important aspect of Roman sexual culture, particularly where public officials were concerned. A Roman man's inability to exercise control over his own sexual impulses showed that he was unable to wield political power judiciously and effectively. Therefore, aligning Domitian with the sexually intemperate tyrant is an effective way to explain the denial of his deification and to justify the memory sanctions against him. Still, the problem that ancient authors, specifically Pliny the Younger and Suetonius, reference with Domitian is not just his sexual intemperance, it's also his hypocrisy, a characteristic that other condemned emperors seem to share. The ancient tyrant is hypocritical because he attempts to legislate around issues, but fails to adhere to his own laws. A good example of this is when Domitian expels a public official from the jury for divorcing his wife who had committed adultery, then taking her back. But Suetonius later mentions that Domitian did the exact same thing with his own wife when she cheated on him with an actor. Now, there are also differences in historical narrative that go a long way in denigrating Domitian's memory. With Suetonius' method of historical construction, he begins his biography by listing all of Domitian's good deeds and moral legislation, before he abruptly turns to all of his sexually hypocritical behavior. Now, when I first read the Suetonius Domitian biography, I was a little confused about why Domitian abruptly becomes a hypocrite. Rather than following a chronological sequence of events, Suetonius actually divides his narrative thematically along the lines of good and bad. The point of this organization is to draw a stark contrast between the good Domitian and the bad Domitian, which further emphasizes his faults and his hypocrisy. Pliny the Younger, on the other hand, portrays Domitian as a sexual hypocrite throughout his reign. There's a story about the Vestal Virgin, Cornelia, who had taken a vow of chastity. Suetonius mentions the story in his section about the good Domitian, stating that Domitian had punished the Vestal Virgin for breaking her vow of chastity, which we would assume is a good thing. He does not return to the story, so we're left to think that Domitian did something good. Pliny the Younger, on the other hand, in his account, says that the Vestal Virgin is innocent, and Domitian sentences her to death, even though she has done nothing wrong, and he himself is conducting an affair with his niece. Here, we're supposed to see that he's a hypocrite. Now, both writers accomplished the task of aligning Domitian with sexual license and tyranny. They proved that he was unsuited for deification, and that the Senate had a moral imperative to castigate his memory. For Pliny specifically, there was never any good in Domitian at all. There was simply only bad. Now, if the first quote that I began with explains the act of Damnation Memoriae, then the quote that I will be closing with explains the intent. The history that we consume is often motivated by a variety of reasons and rarely free from biases. As Pliny himself confesses in a letter, the purpose of his post-Domitianic writings is to punish Domitian, and his writings successfully do this, because they perpetuate Domitian's memory sanctions. To understand exactly how imperial memory was constructed in Rome, we must study Damnation Memoriae and Imperial Deification together, because they played off each other, at the initiation of memory sanctions and in the writings that perpetuate them. Thank you.
Spoiler, sorry. Okay, hi everyone, my name is Hailey, as Professor Sterk said. Today I'm going to be talking about how classical education shaped the early Christian theology of Marius Victorinus and St. Augustine of Hippo. So, using my title as a kind of roadmap to guide us, I'm going to briefly discuss 6 points. First, I'm going to talk about the context, i.e. where and when all of these events are taking place. Then I'm going to introduce the main characters, if you will, of my story, St. Augustine of Hippo and Marius Victorinus. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about both Christianity and education and kind of how they interact with each other in this Greco-Roman period, which we call late Antiquity. And then I'm also going to talk about some specific works of St. Augustine and Marius Victorinus, and I'll talk about their significance and how they still are relevant today. So Carthage and Rome are the two cities in which our main characters spent the most time and which are central to developments in Roman history. So by the 4th century, both of these cities were very established imperial powerhouses. They had spent centuries dominating their respective continents, and they were also keeping a very close eye on each other. While experiencing a period of great political growth, becoming powers both militarily and intellectually, they started to interact with each other a lot more at the dawn of the 4th century. So it was in this political and intellectual backdrop that St. Augustine and Marius Victorinus were growing up, being educated, and also becoming educators themselves. So St. Augustine, disclaimer, not the city in Florida like one of my roommates thought. He is a man. He's the decidedly well more known figure of the two. He's the author of several works that were foundational to not only Western civilization in the Middle Ages, but also modern Christianity as we know it. These works include The City of God, which is a philosophy or theology of history, and his autobiography, The Confessions, which is often considered the first of its genre. So he spent his youth in North Africa, specifically in the cities of Thagaste and Madura. He received a typical primary and secondary education of the time, and then he went to Carthage to complete his training in rhetoric. After completing his education, he became a professor of rhetoric, first in Carthage and then eventually in Rome. And I go into more detail about this later on, but it's important to know that while Latin was the dominant language in both Carthage and Rome, Augustine's classical education was heavily grounded in Greek philosophy, both in content and its style. and the Greek philosophy he encountered during this education was instrumental in his eventual conversion to Christianity. And another influence on his conversion was Marius Victorinus. He converted a generation prior to St. Augustine, and we learn about this through an extensive passage in St. Augustine's Confessions. He's a parallel to St. Augustine in a lot of other ways as well. He also grew up in North Africa and eventually moved to Rome to become a professor of rhetoric as well. And during his teaching career, he was also instrumental in translating several philosophical texts into Latin from Greek. Specifically, he translated the Book of the Platonists, as they're called in the Confessions, and he too converted later in life in an extreme old age, as we learned from St. Jerome. And after pursuing his career as a rhetor or a teacher of rhetoric, and then educationally, he had a very similar background to St. Augustine, steeped in Greek philosophy, which also influenced his study of rhetoric. And then sometime after his conversion, the pagan emperor Julian the Apostate banned Christians from teaching in higher education. And he did this based on the argument that Christians were unable to faithfully teach these Greek classics, and this caused Victorinus to voluntarily give up his position as a teacher of rhetoric. So this also highlights a key problem that's kind of emerging in the increasingly Christian Roman emperor. There's a strained relationship between the rapidly expanding religion of Christianity and the classical culture that had really strong ties to Greek philosophy. So early Christianity, as I said, had several ties to Greek philosophy. For one, they shared a common language. The New Testament was originally written in Greek, and their education was centered around the Greek classics and Greek philosophy. It was a no-brainer for the early Christians to turn to these works and these philosophers to help explain key philosophical tenets and key tenets of Christianity. So both Greek and Latin scholars used the argumentative style of Greek philosophy to make their points and to in turn convert people who were intimately familiar with these philosophies. An example of this is depicted in this image here. So this is a picture of the Apostle Paul preaching in the Areopagus, which is an area of key religious importance in the Greek city of Athens. And here he gives a speech modeled on the Greek philosophical style that's intended to convert these people who had based their education on Greek philosophy. So now we turn to where these Christians learned about Greek philosophy, which was in their education. So education was decidedly, sorry for the formatting there. Education was decidedly not Christianized in the 4th century when Marius Victorinus and St. Augustine were growing up. The first two parts, the primary school and grammar school, I would say are somewhat equivalent to our elementary, middle school, maybe the first couple of years of high school. Primary school students learn their letters, how to read, how to write, and they're learning these skills in both Greek and Latin, Greek first and Latin second. And a common model for these was the Latin and Greek classics, such as the Iliad and the Aeneid. And the real star of the show, however, was the school of rhetoric, which I think St. Augustine describes really well in this quote from the Confessions. He says, "This is the school where men are made masters of words. This is where they learn the art of persuasion, so necessary in business and debate." So the school of rhetoric was also built on the foundation of Greek philosophy. Throughout their early education, as I said, students learned a lot about the Latin and Greek classics, and this continues into the school of rhetoric. Speeches were also a really important part of it. They learned theoretical and practical aspects of speech making. But beyond learning about the classics and how to give speeches, they also learned a lot about philosophy and about Plato in particular. And at this stage, Plato's ideas were being transmitted by the so-called Neoplatonists, who had updated his works to be slightly more applicable to the current culture. And the Neoplatonists were of particular importance to Marius Victorinus and St. Augustine. So each of them used different ideas from Neoplatonism in their Christian theological works, which demonstrates the integration of these two disciplines. So on the left here in Marius Victorinus' Trinitarian works, in Hymn 1, he says, "Of God, you precede all plurality, known even though limitless. In you, no plurality, for no plurality even proceeds from you. Without measure, the Father is then, but the Son is both measured and measureless. So here he's making a direct reference to the Platonic idea of the one. And the one to the Platonists is really similar to what our modern Christian conception of God is. It's described as being beyond being, unlimited, and undetermined, a notable turn in description for higher powers if we think about like the Greek pantheon, Zeus, Hera. These are very personified people. And then the idea of plurality is also of particular importance to St. Augustine. In his conversion, it gave him a way to conceptualize God as this infinite incorporeal being, which is another reason that we connect Marius, Victorinus, and St. Augustine together. And St. Augustine, in his book, De Trinitate, or On the Trinity, he references a different but related Platonic idea. So he says, if both the Son and the Holy Spirit are sent there where they were, we must inquire how that sending, whether of the Son or the Holy Spirit, is to be understood. For of the Father alone, we nowhere read that he is sent. So this is a direct reference to what we refer to as the generation of spirits. And the Neoplatonic idea of the generation of spirits focuses on the idea of emanation, which is another word kind of for generation. So it's a sort of sending, and it's similar to the sending of the Son and the Holy Spirit from the Father. And the way we're meant to understand this is unique. So they're not being sent as subordinates from God, they're being sent as equals. And through their ability to reascend to the position of God, we see that in the modern conception of the Trinity as well, kind of this circular relationship of these three persons in one. So they're supposed to be equal, not subordinates to him. And St. Augustine and Marius Victorinus, their integration of Christianity and Neoplatonism is still really relevant to us today. And by bringing Christian theology into this conversation with Greek philosophy, they demonstrate this importance. And so, as a student of the liberal arts who's pursuing a degree also in the science field and who's going to complete a graduate degree in science, I think that my classics and history education has been instrumental to my success in these fields, to my application of a broader worldview, and my ability to connect the history of the people that I'm learning about and the future of my practice. So, thank you.
I made it nice and warm. All right, hello everyone. My name is Emma Sparks, and then my project is on a paradox of women's power and Macrina the Younger and female religious authority. I've worked a lot with women in monasticism, and I have a special kind of care and interest in how these structures developed, especially because oftentimes the focus is on men in early Christianity, and I think that women play a very big role more in the background and haven't been historically given credit for that. Okay. So when I was first kind of coming up with my project, I had a couple of the questions that were guiding me, which was kind of how could women exercise authority in a male-dominated church and society, and also how do male-authored sources shape women's historical legacies. Earlier this morning, for people that weren't here, the dean kind of talked about memory and how history can really have an impact on how people are viewed and how we view it today. And I think that when examining my topic, one of my biggest focuses is trying to kind of situate how much you can take from a person's legacy and their impact and their actual historical impact while balancing out the sources that are there and looking at bias and how you can actually mediate through what their true legacy is. So early context, I talk about Macrina the Younger. She is a monastic and ascetic leader in Cappadocia in the 4th century. Cappadocia is in now kind of an area of modern-day Turkey. This period is in the Eastern Roman Empire, and shortly after, it's a couple decades after the Edict of Milan in 313, which largely legalized Christianity and kind of ended mass more persecution of the state, and that really saw an uptick in the rise of Christian asceticism as well as Christianity amongst elite households. And this rise in Christianity in these elite households is really what takes center, especially in the East, and is kind of responsible for this mass more of a kind of monastic movement that I think is more unique to this area. And there's a huge focus on elite families, and especially women become a huge part in the kind of dissemination and conversion of families. And so typically their roles were kind of largely confined to marriage, household, and certain aspects of inheritance that come from marriage. And so there's very little formal avenues for women at this time that would have existed outside of the household, and kind of see a shift, in my opinion, with Macrina and Christianity, and in certain ways for women's authority and place in society. There's also, I'll note, an importance of virginity amongst Christians during this time, men and women, but more so women. And it's important to just very quickly note, because of the aspects of virginity that got associated with the body and purity, it allowed women to really kind of opt into doing this virginity path instead of getting married, which unlocked a huge amount of autonomy in some way, because they no longer had to, especially if you were an elite woman, you no longer had to participate in marriage. You were kind of allowed to go off on the sect and not have to get confined to that if that was your choice. So the Cappadocian family networks, as I was doing my project, I kind of started off caring more about what Victorinus wrote, which was her younger brother, and as I kept going through the sources that he wrote about her, I really realized how important the family culture of this region was. Is largely responsible for the amount of wealth and money that helped disseminate almost a systematic, gradual systematic Christianization of this area that has a unique, in my opinion, very unique and almost systemic religious authority, especially in early Christianity. Their wealth they used in social ways. They often were very involved in almsgivings and were very almost tied into the community. And their families were very close-knit. So not only was your own family circle very close, but you were very close with other aristocratic families. And this kind of created a culture of like family and friendship that was very unique to this area, and I think conducive in a amount of closeness that allowed asceticism to start to branch outward and become more of a monastic type of formation. They're very much focused on their household. There's like these centers of authority that I think you'll see models of the household where with either parents or even the role of women get applied outward onto monasticism in these areas. And then noting that Gregory of Nyssa and Basil of Caesarea are both two of the three Cappadocian fathers. Cappadocian fathers were men that had an extreme impact on the development of Christianity, especially in the East, but overall, and when they went to ecumenical councils that kind of defined Christian doctrine and dogma, they were so influential that a lot of the things that they decided and their ideas lasted until this day. So really trying to get a feel for this area and their family culture is very essential in developing Christian doctrine and influential, has a lasting impact on Christianity even today. So who's Macrina? Like I said a little bit before, she was a monastic and ascetic leader in Cappadocia. She was the eldest daughter of 10 children in a very historical Christian family. She's the younger, her grandma was the elder. So there was already kind of this family following of Christianity, so she was kind of engaging and following in those footsteps. She decided upon the death of her father, who was kind of the leader of their household, her and her mother moved away from a more populated area, and moved to one of their family estates at Ainsley. This is what becomes kind of a huge monastic movement that starts to grow there, and it becomes outside of household asceticism. She started practicing household asceticism, and asceticism is kind of the denial of self-pleasure, and it becomes very popular with Christians during this time, especially women. But what is unique about this part of the 4th century is that we start to see a shift away from individuals. It was very common for people to go into the desert or stay in different areas that were kind of, it was more of an individual practice. And we're seeing with the rise of household asceticism, you see then a rise in more groups coming together that maybe aren't outside of your household. And because of this area and its kind of close-knit culture, you see a rise of, eventually what happens is she frees all of her slaves, and everyone is on this property, and they're all working the same, and it's like this, like everyone's singing Kumbaya. It's like this, it becomes like this, like this, just like it's not free love, but free love in Christianity of people just all working, which is really radical for the time to free all of your slaves and be doing the same work that people that used to be yours are doing. And so they stayed on that property, and over time, people that maybe would have been practicing asceticism on their own, especially women, start to come onto this property, and it grows and grows and grows. And you see a male input as well, because she's still, as the eldest daughter, she's taking care of one of her youngest brothers. The family's there, there's men there as well, and that starts to grow outward as well. So she kind of becomes this intellectual force within her own family and is described as such by her brothers. So yeah, like I said, a little bit about the community. I kind of already touched on it a little bit. I skipped ahead of myself. But this, the model becomes what she practices there. Often became, you'll see later, especially in Basil, Caesarea's, he writes a shorter and longer rules, which are kind of rules for, I want to say monasteries, but he often gets quoted as the father of Eastern monasticism. So he starts to write off things that groups of people that are all doing this asceticism should do. And a lot of what he writes about was already being done in her community. Yeah, so her intellectual influence, when I was first looking into this, I looked a lot of Gregory of Nyssa's writings and was like, yes, this is where she shows up. But the biggest problem with that is because a lot of the information about her really just comes from him. And because he's her brother, there's a lot of, you can't really take what he says all too seriously. To say kind of with a grain of salt. He describes her often as a teacher and a philosopher of God, which to this period is very radical in that she's a woman, and often the term like philosopher would mainly be referred to in like reserved for men. Hailey kind of talked about that Platonic ideals, and that very much was still alive in this period as well, because it's in more of the Eastern Empire that had part of more of a Greek heritage. And so he really kind of solidified her in his writings and was trying to paint her in an image of someone who wasn't just a woman monastic leader, but an intellectual. And so there was no writings of her own that survive, and so the biggest problem through my thesis was trying to figure out how much of her was actually influential, what did she actually do, and how much of it is just Gregory trying to hype up his own family member and have his own authority, because that's a large part of it as well. And yeah, he's kind of my biggest, I hate him and I love him at the same time, because he really does solidify a lot of her memory, and we wouldn't hear about her if he didn't write about her, but then what we hear about her is what his opinions of her. And so there's this kind of a paradox that happens with how much of her authority is actually present because her own memory is being dictated by a male family member. But like I said, he really does, he constructs a narrative he writes a hagiography of her, which would be the exact opposite of a Ken Burns documentary. It is like the entire purpose is to like make her seem like she's a saint. So you have to again kind of weave through that. It's not a biography. It's not trying to make her be, it's not trying to be accurate to a certain extent. And he writes On the Soul of Resurrection, which is a dialogue with her, very Platonic, and mainly both of the goals of these is to try to paint her in this, give her like a sense of authority, intellectual authority, religious authority. But again, like I said before, it's kind of tough because he's writing about her, she's not writing her own stuff, or if she didn't survive. Yeah, and so that's kind of the biggest paradox that I saw in her life, but also can be applied to other women during this period. A lot of religious women that had some levels of authority. There's often these paradoxes of what actually is the extent of which, and it is kind of a mind-numbing task to try to find out how much did they actually do, what is their influence, and is it kind of is it even, is it a failure of attempt to place women in history where maybe they don't belong, but I really do think that they do. It's just kind of, you have to acknowledge that it's going to be a legacy that's been mediated. I'll run through those comparative perspectives pretty quickly. I touch on them very briefly. The biggest thing would be the East versus West. I think that the largest difference is religious women in the West that had some sort of authority were obviously aristocratic, just like they were in the East, but they used their wealth in different ways, more so to act as almost like a patronage. They would fund monasteries more often, and they would do they loved going on a pilgrimage. They loved going on trips. I'm jealous. I read about them, like, that's my study abroad. Like, they love it. Like, they're doing study abroad. So that was kind of more of what they were doing. And you can kind of see in the East, especially with Thecla's she's way earlier in this period, but she kind of starts off that's more Eastern tradition she kind of gets seen with kicks off virginity, and you see kind of as the East develops, it stays, especially in this Cappadocian context, much more community-based in my opinion. But the thing that they all have in common is oftentimes their significance to history is defined by their relationship with men. Whether it is men that are writing about them or like Paula of Rome, who's in the West, she had a very close relationship with St. Jerome, who's a prolific writer and theologian. And so often your importance gets attached to a more important man. It's kind of a problem. So why it matters, I really think that in general there's a kind of a push, at least there has been in scholarship in late antiquity with women. Elizabeth Clark has written a lot about this. With trying to identify women in spaces where they've been, but also knowing that you can't have lot of times a radical feminist take starts to become unrealistic from where they actually participated and the extent of their influence. So I think that this my thesis really has helped to kind of figure out or come up with ways to examine where women's legacies are present and how much accuracy you can define to them. I really do think that in general, the goal of my project was to try to paint women's religious power and authority in late antique Christianity as not an exception to the rule, but as a part of the development of Christianity in history. But it just needs some careful examination to try to kind of figure out where it's at. Yeah, overall, now I'm good. I'm good. Yeah.
Great, hi everyone. Like Professor Sterk said, my name is Ainsley, and today I'll be presenting on my thesis, which is titled Blessed Among Women, the Virgin Mary on the Islamic Frontier. So kind of exploring the Virgin Mary as a lens through which to view early influences of Christianity on the advent of Islam, especially in the 7th century, but even into the modern day. So I will start off my presentation with how I start off my thesis, which is a quote from the Hadith, which is a collection of sayings that are attributed to Muhammad and things that he might have said during his lifetime. And so this Hadith says, Allah's apostles said, "Many amongst men reached the level of perfection, but none amongst the women reached this level, except Asia, Pharaoh's wife, and Mary, the daughter of Imran." So we already see a direct example of respect and admiration for the Virgin Mary in this Hadith. And I'm going to use the term, just to clarify, the term veneration a lot throughout this presentation. In its most basic form, to venerate is to regard with reverential respect or with admiring deference. And it's a more Christian-centric term. You'll probably hear it a lot in Christian debate and theology. But it's a good word to use to kind of discuss how both early Christians and Muslims would have respected and adored the Virgin Mary for her role in each respective religion. And so I'm going to use it a lot, but that is what I mean when I say veneration throughout this presentation. All right, so this is kind of the outline of my research and the outline of my paper and what I'm going to talk about today. So first, what kind of got me into this topic in general was exploring Mary in Christian and Islamic texts, specifically the Quran and the Bible, and then moving more into early Christian veneration, what Christians would have been doing around the time of the advent of Islam, and then Arab-Christian interactions in the Middle East in these regions to showcase how the influence of early Christian veneration could have influenced the Islamic development and veneration of Mary in both the 7th century and then taking that again to the modern period. So talking a little bit about Christian and Islamic texts, I utilized the Bible and the Quran quite a bit throughout my paper, but the picture up there is the Annunciation narrative. So in specifically Luke in the Bible, the angel Gabriel appears to Mary and tells her that she will conceive a son by the Holy Spirit, and that son will be considered holy, the Son of God. So that's kind of the basis of the incarnation, one of the key Christian doctrines at the time that Jesus came down from the Holy Spirit and was conceived and was born the Son of God. And then in the same kind of way, in Surah 3 of the Quran, the angel Gabriel tells Mary she will conceive a son, and she says, "How can this be? I've never been with a man." And the angel says that the Spirit of Allah will come upon her and allow her to conceive. The major difference between the two religions is obviously that Jesus is not viewed as divine in Islam. He is viewed as a prophet, but the Islamic narrative maintains the virginity of Mary, even though the description of Jesus changes, which shows a direct correlation between both Christian and Islamic understandings of Mary. Maintaining her virginity, especially in other surahs and other mentions of Mary throughout the Quran, we can see her virginity continually emphasized, which is a really important aspect, especially of early Christian understanding and veneration of Mary as well. And so this idea kind of takes us into early Christian veneration. What did early Christians think of Mary? And so we have some of the earliest prayers to the Virgin Mary, where she's referred to as Theotokos, which means God-bearer, where she is supplicated for help by early Christians. And so this really showcases the love and admiration that they had for the Virgin Mary. She's seen as close to God. She is viewed as in heaven with God, so she can take Christian prayers to God for Christians. And so that is a really good example of the already beginning veneration of Mary before this prayer, the one on papyrus up there, was from the 3rd century, so already before the advent of Islam. And then the mosaic up there is a picture of the Dormition of Mary, or sometimes called the Assumption of Mary, which is when traditionally she was assumed bodily into heaven instead of dying like a mortal death. And so this is a big Marian feast, especially in the early church. A big Marian feast is celebrated on August 15th. And there are also other Marian feasts like the Incarnation or the Annunciation and the Nativity of Mary as well that are celebrated. So Christians already understood, loved, and adored Mary at this time, and their understanding of Mary would have been spread throughout Christian communities in the Roman Empire as Christianity is legalized, and then out towards the Middle East as well. So then we also have kind of a fun archaeological example of Marian veneration. So this is the Kathisma Church. This is a church that is found sitting between Bethlehem and Jerusalem, kind of traditionally on the way to where Mary would have given birth to Jesus. So it's said to be a place that she would have rested on her way, and they built a church there in honor of her. And this church was actually converted to a mosque after the Islamic conquest of Jerusalem. So they maintained the integrity of the building, but they turned it into a mosque. And they also based, it's said that they based the architecture of the Dome of the Rock, which is one of the largest Islamic architectural feats in Jerusalem, sits on top of the Temple Mount, that they based that building on the Kathisma Church. So kind of showcasing the admiration and respect they had for a place that was built originally by Christians for the Virgin Mary, but maintained its integrity even in Islamic practice as well. Then we move to talking about Arab-Christian interactions pre and post the advent of Islam. And so some of the best examples we have of early Muslims interacting with Christians actually comes from both references to Christians in the Quran, but then also the Najran delegation of 631. So that is where Muhammad and some of his followers actually met with Christians from Najran, a little bit south in the Arabian Peninsula, and they discussed things like theology, the divinity of Jesus, Christianity in general, and they kind of had interfaith discussions in this meeting to kind of help facilitate more coexistence and understanding between the two with the emergence of Islam at the time. And this also established a jizya tax, which is a tax on non-believer, non-Muslims in Muslim-controlled areas, but it allowed those communities to maintain the ability to practice their religion, whether that be Christianity, Judaism, whatever that might be, at the expense of paying this tax. So there's more interfaith conversations happening within these interactions. And then after the Islamic conquest of the 8th century, Muslims expanded outward into cities like Jerusalem, which had Christian communities, as well as out into the broader Arabian Peninsula. So we see large conversions and sharing of ideas between those communities that are kind of conquered by the Islamic Empire. So this kind of takes us to Islamic veneration and piety from the 7th century to the more present day. So one of these examples comes from another hadith tradition that we have. So this can be traced back to about the 8th century. And it's stated that Muhammad actually went into the Kaaba, which is the picture on your left up there, and he cleared, so the Kaaba traditionally was a place of massive idol worship. A lot of polytheistic gods were present in there, and he went into the Kaaba and he cleared it out, and he got rid of all the false gods, all of the false idols that were present there, but he left up a picture of Jesus and Mary on the wall. So this hadith kind of states that he did that. Again, whether or not these hadith are like 100% historically accurate is a debate amongst scholars, but the fact that this hadith would even have been able to be spread and accepted by the Islamic community at the time already showcases a respect and admiration for the Virgin Mary, that they would maintain the integrity of her photograph in the, or her picture in the Kaaba in this hadith. And then if we trace that into the more present time, there are places that you'll see Muslims take pilgrimages that are actually dedicated to the Virgin Mary. So this picture right here is called the House of Ephesus, or the House of the Virgin in Ephesus. So this would have been a place traditionally where people believed that the Virgin Mary was assumed into heaven from this place. So again, when the Feast of the Assumption was established, especially as a dogmatic part of theology within the Catholic Church, which would have been in the 1960s, this became a major pilgrimage site for both Catholics and Muslims and Christians in general to go. And it's actually reported that on the Feast of the Assumption, on August 15th, 1960, it's reported that 2,000 Muslims were present at the House of Mary to the only 600 Catholics that were present there. So huge pilgrimage numbers to this place. There's also discussions of pilgrimages to the Oratory of Mary, which is a place that's traditionally said to have been where the Virgin Mary was consecrated in the temple, next to the cradle of Jesus. So there's large pilgrimages there too, kind of tracing back to Islamic ideas of Mary's early life. We also see that in apocryphal texts, like the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of the Infancy of Mary, her living in the temple, which is also something that is maintained throughout both of those traditions. And then to kind of close off, why is this topic important? Why did I choose to do this? And so I think that Mary helps bridge the gap between Christianity and Islam in a particular way. She lives on the frontier of Islam as it expands into Christian areas, as it comes up against theological debates and Christian communities with Islamic expansion. And she is a lens through which to view interfaith relationship and discussions amongst Christians and Muslims and non-religious people as well. There is no doubt that early Christianity heavily influenced the view of Mary in Islam, coming up against, in these conversations and coming up against practices and reverences towards the Virgin Mary. These religions are able to share faith and share understanding with one another. I also think she's very interesting to view as a woman, so heavily respected in both of these religions, as she is held in high regard in both Christianity and in Islam, and her virginity and chastity and purity are maintained in both, when they are very differently emphasized in general in both as well. So it's very interesting to view her as a woman who's heavily adored too. Even some Islamic scholars would claim that she can be put on the level of a prophet. That just depends on who you ask, but she's very heavily adored in both religions. And so I think Pope Benedict XVI says it best in 2006. He said this at the House of Ephesus, so at that pilgrimage site. He said, "From here in Ephesus, a city blessed by the presence of Holy Mary, who was loved and venerated by Muslims, we raise to the Lord a special prayer for peace between peoples. In this part of the Anatolian Peninsula, a natural bridge between continents, let us implore peace and reconciliation." Thank you.
All right, folks, we have about 25 minutes for questions before we get to lunch, so.
We don't have to take all that time.
So I encourage questions, not just that they all have to answer, but if you have questions for individuals on their papers, please feel free to jump in and identify yourself. Charlie.
Hi, Charlie McNamara from CNRC. Thanks so much for all these papers. These are really great. I have a question that's maybe most directly for Carole and Emma, but I think Hailey and Ainsley, this also goes in what you were saying. I was really struck by the kind of anxiety about objectivity in a lot of these sources. So, for example, Pliny, when we're talking about Damnation Memoriae, he's kind of announcing his motivations about how he wants to present. Like, he's not trying to be like a just the facts man reporter, right? And then Emma, you alluded a couple times to Gregory's, let's say, partial representation of his relative. Hailey, of course, we could talk about the kind of, let's say, importance of persuasion and just like rhetoric as a practice, generally speaking, for Augustine. And I think Ainsley also, the reliability, let's say, of these like sayings attributed to Muhammad and Mahdi. And I'm just wondering, for all four of you, maybe, did you find the attitude toward objective sources, or like a factual presentation of these various, scenarios that you're talking about in your topics here? Were you ever struck by someone who seemed to have like a very modern affinity for objective presentation of facts? Or were you always kind of reminded of, people maybe weren't so concerned to be like purely factual in their presentation of narratives? Kind of an open-ended question, but feel free.
Carole, Charlie, you can go first.
Thank you for asking, as someone who works in this field. For me specifically, because of the nature of my project, being that I'm studying someone who literally had a lot of the writings written during his time destroyed, I found it really hard to find objective sources. Like with Pliny the Younger, when I was reading all his letters, he's mainly just beating down and punching below the belt. One of the scholars I did cite in my paper was trying to talk about how for most of these scholars, because they had worked during Domitian's administration and they were still around trying to enter the new imperial administration after he died, their writings are very castigatory because they're trying to basically undamn themselves, and they're trying to basically show like, oh, I was only working in this terrible administration because I need to like preserve myself. So it was really difficult to find anyone who, and I definitely do think that Domitian was probably a terrible emperor, but it was hard to find anyone who would say anything different. Like when Suetonius is talking about maybe the good things that Domitian did, he's mainly just setting it up for a contrast between good Domitian and bad Domitian, so couldn't really take anything he said very seriously, unfortunately.
I mean, I think in regards to primary sources, like specifically from our time periods, like everyone does kind of have an agenda about what they're speaking about, especially like when I read St. Augustine's Confessions and like for Marius Victorinus' passage, like the point of a work like that is to say something about the kind of person that Augustine is, and not only who he is, but who he wants other people to believe that he is. And I think that even like now, like you mentioned, like modern objective facts, I think it's getting harder to find people who don't have some reason they're writing the piece that they're writing. And I think that, especially like in our primary sources, that's really evident, especially when if you're not writing as the emperor, you're thinking about what the emperor is going to think about your writing. So I think that adds another layer too.
I'll say in general, I think any source, everyone's got an agenda. So I think for this period uniquely, it's not like you're running into, when you read a primary source, you should, for any type of history that you're studying, you should always be like, what's the agenda and who's the audience? So not really when I was examining the primary sources, that's already in my mind. I think when I examined a lot of secondary scholarship, I don't think that there was people that were like, I think in general, this period's been very established that there's a lot of interpretations to be had and there's a lot of characters from this time, so I don't think that I often ran into that. I think the issue of why maybe I hit home really hard on trying to find more objective information about like Macrina's life is because of the previous lack of attention towards female monastic leaders. And so I was trying to find, there's kind of, when so much information and time and effort has been contributed in academia to one section, there's a lot of evidence for one area, I think there's kind of an extra push to try to find information in other areas and kind of push back against, well, there is evidence for it, and so I think that kind of comes into play and is why there's maybe I push for more trying to find objective information about what she actually did, but yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I think for I think for me, like especially when you're looking at texts that are like more like directly religious, like these are people's holy texts, like it's hard to like take everything that's said as like objective truth because there comes matters of faith in all things, but especially in these texts. And so when looking at like the Hadith, for example, I wasn't looking at like whether this might have happened or not, or whether like 100% Muhammad said this or did this, but the more objective truth in reality that like people believed that he did. And so just like people believe in the incarnation or they don't, like these things are hard to prove objectively, but they tell you a lot about what people were thinking at the time. And so I try to take the truth out of that more so. Yeah.
I have a follow-up to that, that's okay. So knowing that, right, and as this is a project, so you were trying to find objective writing, do you find yourself, I mean, how have you applied that to modern day?
Well, I guess at the corollary, we were talking during the presentations just a little bit. Did you all, because as you were all giving your presentation, I was assuming all of the work that you've done, there's so many parallels to everything that you all said to today. Lack of objectivity, quote unquote information, that sort of thing. I mean, as you were doing your project, was that in the back of your mind?
Or just in practice, right? In practice, as you're reading the news, as you're, you're like, you use the same objectivity, or is that preserved for projects?
Yeah, I think like that's part of like the broader liberal arts education too, like the ability to read text critically, be thinking about the agenda of who's writing it, especially like news, looking at like, is this CNN, is this Fox News, is this a blog, thinking about those things, I think that maybe you do it more subconsciously versus I don't think that much when I open up like a New York Times article. I don't know if I'm like, okay, who's this writer? What else have they written? Who do I think they're writing for? I think it's more of like a subconscious skill that you picked up on and then apply to the rest of your life after.
I actually think about that quite a bit. Again, also poli-sci majors, whenever I watch the news obsessively, I'm very frantic. And I'm always very deeply concerned and preoccupied with how we're going to remember this current presidency, maybe like 100 years from now. It's something I'm very fascinated by. So I don't necessarily read the news now with the idea of whether it's objective. Now I'm more concerned with how we're going to teach our history of this moment in maybe 100 years from now and how people will remember it. Yeah.
I was actually going to say one of the things that I was thinking about is like, yes, with looking at objective sources, but I think it's really funny in a way because with what we were working with, there's not as many voices necessarily in the mix, and as opposed to now, there's too many. So I think that it's interesting to see like, yes, the necessity to be objective when reviewing sources is probably even higher now than it was prior, but I think it's that is maintained. There's been a continuity of that, but it is very interesting because when you have very little, you have to work with what you have. In this case, there's just so much all the time. So I think there's a kind of a little bit of a difference in that, but it's going to be in your brain just from being involved in history.
Yeah, I think what Hailey said about like the context of a liberal arts education is just like so helpful to understand the importance of the context of what you're reading and the context of what you're looking at, and where it comes from. Like, I'm taking back to like 5th grade when my teacher was like, who is the author? Who is the audience? Like, who is it for? Because, like Emma said, not everything is for everyone now, but it's everywhere. And so I think it is really important to try and be as objective as possible, but like, that's actually not possible at all at the end of the day.
Way in the back, yeah.
So this will be for the latter two papers.
Who are you?
I'm Elijah Wallace. I do history. You're all there. Anyway, should I say 7th year? Yeah, no. I'm writing. So, the question would be, it's quite obvious with the whole debate about the Theotokos, which people say the role of women monastics in both the West and East. And I like that you brought up that contrast of it being sort of this local centered thing versus this more peripatetic style of aristocratic women in the West that exists. And you think about Genevieve as well, so actual female ascetics doing the same stuff that men have been doing during this period. So I guess the first question would be, why is there that difference? Is it just a difference in urbanization? And so in the East, there are villages everywhere, there are cities, and so that domestic style stays longer, right? Versus in the West, you have these large, estates, and then you have the frontier with the military, and so people just tend to wander around more or have these very local cultic centers like tours, right? And you only get those domestic sort of communities in places like Rome and Ravenna, right? So what is the difference there? And then how do we sort of excavate this very female-centered history of the late Empire and the early church? Because we all sort of know, if we engage with there, we all sort of know it exists, but I think, as y'all are pointing out, it's far more critical to the history of the late Empire, well, not the East, the late Empire in the West and the continuing Empire in the East, and also the development of both Christianity and early Islam, right? And even you can throw in rabbinic Judaism in there as well. So how do we make this a main part of the narrative, as people at the time definitely believed it was part of the narrative of the sort of changes within the empire and the growth of the church? So, I hope that was somewhat clear.
Well, I'll do my best, and I'll do my best. And if I have a memory of a goldfish, I'll ask for the second part of the question again. I'm not afraid to look like an idiot. So, for the East and West, typically I think that what I really saw was it was a main difference in culture. I think it kind of also goes with their economic differences, especially during that time, the transition from the West being more of a main center of the empire to the East becoming that, I think also causes a shift where you're seeing a large amount of the church in the West became very more political in that area, and with that became more economic and the center of power control that I think had with the aristocratic families there, almost sense of a cohesion with where they were spending their money and why you're seeing them do more of acts of patronage where they're building up more monasteries, and there's more of that wealth aspect that's kind of tied into its spread, where I think in the East it very much, a lot of the early church was founded there in comparison to the West. Talking about Theotokos, it's Greek, right? So a huge part of where Christianity is coming out of is in that same area. So I think that on top of not only do you have a different culture of like family and their more of a Greek system, you're also seeing these different like episcopal sees and different cities and areas being kind of the center of where Christianity is developing out of, and I think that contributes to more of their difference in development and kind of almost more of a community type of approach. You can see that kind of spread later when you talk about ecumenical councils and the West and the Pope really wanting to have a say and having his panties in a bunch because he feels left out. He's so far away from where everything else is going on. So I think that kind of contributes to more of it's the overall like patterns of East and West. I think it kind of, you can almost look at the massive movements of women during that time and put them in those broad categories if you want to. And then the second question, I forgot kind of, what was it? I knew I would, that's why I prefaced with it.
How do you make the role of women and the generation of female figures and role of monastic travelers, whatnot, how do you make that more legible? Because people who study church history sort of just know it and take it for granted, and then popular, thought, monks are just, dudes and robes, out in the desert eating crickets, right? And so that element of the role of, the very important role of women, we even think of conversion narratives, right? Of how it's always the royal women that get it done, right? Ethiopia, Armenia, Georgia, right? It's very critical, and also in Iran, right? So how do we bring that forward and sort of deconstruct the narrative of like grubby old men in the desert?
Writing about it more, researching about it more. I think that there's been a lot of work done, and even in the last 10 years, really kind of actually standing on the shoulders of women like Elizabeth Clark that have done like a lot of work to kind of bring women more into this frame. I think the biggest thing is kind of getting them out of the shadow of men. I think a lot of times they get grouped into a narrative. So it would be, oh, let's talk about Jerome. Oh yeah, Paul is there too. Oh, let's talk about the Cappadocian Fathers. Oh yeah, Macrina's there too. Or oh, let's talk about early apocryphal texts. Let's talk about the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Thecla's in there. She's important because she's attached to Paul. So I think trying our best now to try to separate them as much as we can, while also acknowledging that it's very hard to separate, that most often their importance is being given to them by their attachment to men historically. So I think it's gonna take either an effort to like do more research and produce more works where you're trying to shift away from that, while also acknowledging why there's even knowledge about them in the first place. But I think in general, just trying to focus, giving them their own effort and attention that maybe they've historically been grouped or looped into with. That's the best I got.
Yeah, I mean, from the perspective of the Virgin Mary, it's really hard to separate her from the man that really brings her to the forefront. But I think, there has been, especially in more like Islamic thinking, the concept of Mary as like a very important woman, as discussed in some of the readings that I did too. Like there is a debate about her possibly being considered as a prophet. But as well as like being compared to Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad, and like as another really important woman in early Islamic understanding. And so I think like, especially like in Shia Islam, that's like a huge thing. So having her placed on like scale with both Fatima, but then also with Jesus, kind of does elevate her already a little bit. And then I also wanted to hit on the East-West debate for my like the relevance of my paper too, because I did look into like more of the Eastern Church, and as like the Church of the East developed, like a huge part of that was the concept of the Theotokos and like whether or not you were like supposed to call Mary Theotokos, or whether or not she was actually the mother of God divine or just the human nature of Christ, with the whole Nestorianism thing, which is a whole other beast in and of itself. But the concept of like the divinity of Christ, and then that also being tied directly to like the role of Mary and whether or not she is the mother of God, like how important she is in both early Christianity, but then taking her as like, if she is only the mother of the human person of Christ, then in the Islamic theology that makes a lot of sense, right? She birthed Christ as a human, and that can be taken directly from like a more Nestorian approach to understanding Mary in the East, at least. Whereas in the West, they're like, no. So yeah.
I'm in Taiwan with Hailey, but actually I have a question for you, Ainsley. I know that like in Catholicism, you mentioned they believe that Mary remained a virgin. And Protestants believe she went on to go have James, and that's very important for us. I was wondering, in your readings of Islamic literature, what do they kind of say? I know that they believe, you said that she remained a virgin, but how do they kind of dispute that she didn't have James?
That's a really good question. Yes, so she's referred to quite a bit in the Quran as like pure and chaste and blessed. But they don't really like go necessarily into the life of Jesus as much, so it isn't really like a relevant point to her role as like a woman in Islam. Like she is like the mother of Jesus, but and Jesus is just a prophet, so it's like family lineage doesn't matter as much. I would like to look into that more. I would like to read a little bit more of the Quran to get more like context for that, but I just focus more on her as the mother of Jesus and not the other narratives.
So they just kind of hold that she remained a virgin in the Quran.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jake Henke. I'm also in the history program, primarily working in late antiquity, early medieval Middle East. First of all, thank you all for your papers here. This is really a great presentation. I do have two perhaps more granular questions, one for Carole and one for Ainsley. So Carole, in your research of this phenomenon of Damnation Memoriae, how exactly did your study grapple with the fact that the process is supposed to eliminate the name of this emperor for their sort of awful deeds, and yet we have the sources which are very much talking about, and in a way perpetuating the memory of these individuals, curating it in a particular way. How did you grapple with that dimension? And then Ainsley, in your studies, as you were looking at the Virgin Mary, how did you find that the Islamic prohibition on the veneration of images in particular as sort of idolatry, and then the factor of iconoclasm which creeps into the sort of Greek East, how did that shape veneration practices for the Virgin Mary in that context?
I actually love that question because it's something that I did think about very heavily as I was writing my paper, because I'm still writing my paper. So at first, when I first learned about Damnation Memoriae, when you hear like the translation like condemnation of memory, it's very different from what I like originally thought as like someone being just thrown into oblivion, that we're not going to remember this person, but very much the process. Like one of the pictures I showed was one of Domitian's edicts being etched out, which you would think means you're trying to forget someone, but a lot of literary sources on these condemned emperors are very polemical, very, we don't like this person, here's why this person doesn't deserve this, they're a tyrant, blah, blah, blah. Which is why I think the process is more so cautionary with like a side of punitive. We're trying to show, like, the process is trying to give an example to other emperors of if you do this, here's what's probably going to happen to you. So we're not necessarily forgetting someone, but it's more so we're trying to reshape history and reshape how we kind of conceive of the memory of this emperor and how we want other people to behave. And this is the imperative of how the future emperors should conduct themselves to avoid basically being like getting a screw you for eternity. Yeah.
Yes, and then talking about like icons and iconoclasm and veneration, like that's also why it's like hard to kind of just paint the word veneration onto both religions and like find a word that kind of went with both in that way, because there is like a large tradition of not having images and not having like what Christians would traditionally do to venerate Mary is like make mosaics and look at her. That's just not what Islam has developed into. So when it came down to it, it was more looking at the respect and the reverence held for her in different texts, and then also even taking that into the modern day, looking at pilgrimages, and also looking at like her comparison to Fatima again in that way, because there also aren't images of her either, but she is held in high reverential respect. And then even looking at like using Miriam as a namesake for a lot of Muslims, like that showcases a high level of respect for her. I did not get into the iconoclasm debates in my own research amongst early Christians, but that does definitely play a role in like how early Christians viewed Mary, like when they came down to like what would have been portrayed of her physically in different spaces. So that's something that is definitely worth exploration for sure.
Oh, forgot to say something. Sorry. Damnation Memoriae also has its roots in the Republican period, which is not where I'm focusing, and there you can see more of like the actual forgetting of these people, and we're not really writing terrible things about them. But in the Imperial period, there's more a focus on castigating them in the literature. Yeah.
Yeah, for Ainsley.
Perfect. Can you speak loudly, please?
Yes, for Ainsley, you mentioned a number of sort of regional phenomenon, specifically like the city of Edessa, Shia Islam, and like from my own study, I know that like Marian veneration is very popular in Egypt in the Christian period. I was wondering if these sort of regional traditions have a continuation between Christian and Islamic periods. Like, do you see more veneration of Mary or more respect for Mary in Islamic Egypt, or does that sort of move?
Yeah, I can give you like one kind of example of that. I found like a more scholarly study on Islamic like education in Egypt, where they do talk a lot about Mary, especially for like young girls in that way. It doesn't make it into my final thesis, but I did see that when I was doing research, and so that is an example of like a more regional phenomenon with that as well. And then again with like Nestorianism and the Church of the East understanding Mary, that bleeding into the Arabian Peninsula as and especially as like the Islamic frontier expanded, seeing like the way that Mary would have been understood by them being more closely related to Islamic understanding is another kind of example of that. But yeah, I'd like to look more into that as well.
Go for it.
A question for Hailey. The two quotes you had at the end when you talked about, let's see here, about the generation of spirits, and you used the phrase emanation. Do you know if, I don't know if this is something you studied, but when they were writing the Nicene Creed, they talk about the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father and then proceeding from the Son. Is that concept of emanation, is that where that comes from?
Yeah, I didn't look specifically at like the Nicene Creed at all, a little bit different time, but I think that because Augustine uses that like Neoplatonic idea of the generation of spirits and his conceptualization of the Trinity, and he was extremely influential in those later time periods, I think you could draw that line through. I don't know if I can explicitly say that like that's a fact, but yeah.
Any final thoughts?
Perfect. If we're
We've got a tiny bit delay on getting lunch up here.
oh, okay.
We've got beverages.
Say one thing, if we're gonna
Go for it.
We're gonna momentarily take a break for lunch. I do want to get all